Dear son, learn to draw. Try to make your hand so unconsciously adept that it will put down what you feel without your having to think of your hands. An apple, what does it mean? The object drawn doesn't matter so much. It's what you feel about it. The object of art is to save yourself. Any cleanness I have in my own life is due to my feeling for words. The fools who write articles about me think that one morning I suddenly decided to write and began to produce masterpieces.
But actually, in terms of his first masterwork, this wasn't the case. Known for conjuring up stories of small-town folk and even of himself, Sherwood Anderson wrote like he tells his son to draw. Unconscious of the line between fact and fiction, he drew the stories that mattered most to himself, out of the simplest materials of his daily life and imagination. In fact, Anderson recalls writing his first major story, Hands, in one sitting in 1915. The story was like a revelation for Anderson. While writing it, he realized he wanted to be a writer. However, his journey to notoriety was a long one, filled with anxieties and the burdens of discovering the artist within himself. Initially, Anderson had never even intended to become a writer. He was born in Camden, Ohio, and only after moving around to many small towns did his family finally settle down in Clyde, Ohio, where Anderson spent his adolescence mainly doing odd jobs around town. Before he ever became a published writer, Anderson excelled as a businessman, working as an advertising writer in Chicago after leaving Clyde. However, between being an ad man and the owner of a paint factory in Elyria, Ohio, and starting a family somewhere along the way, he just never felt fully satisfied. Thanksgiving Day of 1912, what began as a normal day took a turn for the worst. Anderson strolled into work at his Elyria paint factory, complained to his secretary that his feet felt wet, and walked back out the door. But he didn't come back. He was found in Cleveland, 25 miles away, 3 days later, and he didn't know who he was. During this long amnesiac journey, he handwrote a strange 7-page letter to his wife. Anderson's fugue state was a critical moment in his writing career. Forgetting his identity forced him to realize that he wasn't in touch with who he really was. The letter he wrote shows that at the time of the breakdown, his identity wasn't very concrete. It was split between 3 responsibilities: being a business owner, being a family man, and being a writer. He soon came to understand afterward that to find himself and his peace of mind, he would have to settle on a single identity. In the end, he chose writing. For the sake of his mental health and his newfound passion, Anderson left his wife and children behind in Ohio and moved to Chicago in 1913. There he found a lively artistic and literary community he'd never even known existed. He wrote in his memoirs, "It was in Chicago that I first knew other writers and was interested in literature. It was in Chicago newspapers that my own work was first both damned and praised." Anderson lived in what he called the Center of the Little Children of the Arts, a boarding house at 735 Crass Street, with other artists ranging from painters and sculptors to other writers. The wealth of ideas and the close artistic community in the Cosmopolitan Center allowed for the circulation of new experimental forms and artworks. This spread of modernist thought had much to do with the growing medium of the little magazine like Masses, The Dial, and The Little Review, which were known for publishing European and American avant-garde writing, including Anderson's own work. The close-knit community led Anderson to meet other writers like Theodore Dreiser, Carl Sandburg, Floyd Dell, Ben Hecht, and Ernest Hemingway.
Anderson was probably one of the oldest participants in the Chicago Renaissance. I'm pretty sure that most everybody who was involved was already in their 20s. Anderson was in his mid-30s, and so I'm sure they looked at him as granddaddy for the Chicago Renaissance. And I'm pretty certain that if he hadn't been involved with that scene, I really wonder if he would have gone on to become the writer that he did.
Inspired by the wealth of modernist ideas in Chicago, Anderson began to experiment more freely with his writing. Shortly after coming to Chicago in 1913, Anderson attended the Armory Show there, which displayed new techniques in painting, sculpture, and photography. The exhibition brought the avant-garde to America and brought with it a sensation and shock to pre-existing art and literature at the time. The Armory Show inspired Anderson to write more experimentally and represented his newfound freedom of expression and identity. Chicago was a place of transformation, a place where he felt at home, a place where he could write. In 1919, Anderson created something totally new in what would turn out to be his most well-known work, Winesburg, Ohio, a collection of sketches of people in a fictional rural town in Ohio. When still compiling the book in 1916, he described his intentions for Winesburg to novelist and literary critic Waldo Frank. "It is my own idea," he said, "that when these studies are published in book form, they will suggest the real environment out of which present-day American youth is coming." Like most modernists, Anderson experimented with form and touched on themes of anxiety and industrialization. What made him different was that he applied these typically urban themes to a rural landscape, while still holding on to some traditional rural values. Given Anderson's company of avant-garde Chicago writers, it would have made more sense for him at this time to join his modernist friends in writing about city life and the future, which he would later do to some extent, but in Winesburg he was looking into the past, which in many ways, being set in rural Ohio at the end of the 19th century, was his own.
He was writing about the 1800s, and he was remembering the parts that he wanted to remember, and the parts that he didn't know for sure about, he made up. And the parts that somebody told him, he added a little to. But it has the flavor of what Clyde was like at that time.
On the advice of Ernest Hemingway, one of Anderson's mentees, he moved to Paris in 1921. For a year, he immersed himself in the languid artist culture of the city's modernist expatriates, including Hemingway, William Faulkner, and James Joyce. The most notable of these was Gertrude Stein, who was known for her extremely liberal and unconventional use of language. 10 years earlier, Anderson read her book, Tender Buttons, and fell in love with it, while others condemned it for its transgression of the literary norm. While in Paris, the two of them became close friends and remained so for the rest of their lives, frequently exchanging letters and praising each other's work. Paris was a very enlightening experience for Anderson, maybe too enlightening. As he fell more in love with the Parisian bohemian life he considered ideal, he came to believe more and more that American culture was somehow faulty or lacking. This would cause Anderson to once again start looking back on his own life, searching for any trace of this ideal life he believed the French led. Throughout his life, he may not have been entirely content or mentally at ease, considering the country's fast progression into the future. But he found comfort between the present and the past, the rural and the urban, the traditional and the avant-garde. Like his first physical and mental adventure into himself, his stories reflect these paradoxes, and the themes of restlessness and searching for his own individual perspective and story remain at the heart of his work.
I learned that, to be a writer, one has first got to be what he is, what he was born. That to be an American and a writer, one does not necessarily have to pay lip service to any conventional American image. You only had to remember what you were.